Right, so in this lesson we're going to be moving on to the latter half of the 1810s. Last time we covered the Pentrix Uprising and the Sparfields meetings of 1817 being Pentrick and 1816 being the Sparfields meetings. This lesson we're going to cover Peterloo, the March of the Blanketeers and the Luddite disturbances. So this will pretty much finish the most turbulent time of the period. Remember, this will be your biggest paragraph in the essay. So let's get into it with Peterloo. Prior to Peterloo, the government was already on guard as it feared a repeat of the Sparfields meetings. And as you remember, they were fairly violent and revolutionary in nature, it could be argued. Following Sparfields, the radicals sought more constitutional means of effecting change, namely petitioning Parliament, because remember, when they were trying to effect change in a violent and radical manner, they were swiftly suppressed by the military. So, once habeas corpus was restored in early 1818, political prisoners like Henry the Orator Hunt were released. Hunt gave speeches at St. Peter's Fields in Manchester in January 1819, where he set an aggressive tone, demanding change and discouraging petitions, because he did not think that they were effective, as the working class had presented a lot of petitions to Parliament at this point, following Sparfields, and none of them had been taken seriously. So, as a result, authorities were anxious about Hunt's next speech at St. Peter's Fields in August of 1819. So, Peterloo itself, a crowd of 60,000 gathered at St. Peter's Fields on August 16th, 1819, bearing in mind that St. Peter's Fields is located in Manchester. The local magistrates ordered the Manchester Yeomanry to arrest Hunt. This was difficult as he was in the centre of this very large crowd and he was standing on a wagon. And obviously I doubt he would have gone willingly to be arrested again. So the yeomanry got trapped in the crowd, and the magistrates ended up calling in the regular infantry 15th Hussars to rescue the yeomen. Now these were essentially well-trained soldiers who had fought in the Napoleonic Wars, many of them. And the yeomanry, if you don't know, they're essentially the volunteer police force at the time, because obviously the Met wasn't really what it is today, because we've still pretty much got the Bow Street Runners, and we'll come across those in Cato Street. But anyway, this resulted in 11 protesters being killed and 400 to 600 being injured. So that's why it's called Peterloo. It's a reference to the Battle of Waterloo, and it's essentially how in the modern day, following Watergate, we put the suffix gate on the end of everything. So Partygate recently, obviously Watergate itself, the Plebgate affair, essentially just the term to describe the political catastrophe for the government. So did the government deal with Peterloo well? Certainly not, I would say. The government actually opposed what the yeomanry did, but they felt as though they had to commend their actions and award the local magistrates medals, because obviously they didn't want to cause antagonism in the chain of command. But obviously the government would have been very annoyed because this did not make them look good at all, and it was heavily used as an anti-government piece of propaganda. Obviously that picture to the top right showing a anti-government piece of propaganda of the yeomanry beating up the unarmed protesters. And I've just included a picture of Lord Liverpool at the bottom because he was the Prime Minister at the time, and everyone criticised him, but I think he did a fairly decent job, if I'm being honest, but we'll go into him at another time. So let's move on to the March of the Blanketeers. The march took place in March of 1817. It was organised by William Benbow, a weaver from Lancashire, as a hunger march from St. Peter's Fields, Manchester, to London. Bearing in mind this happened 2 years prior to Peterloo. Peterloo happened in 1819. The March of the Blanketeers happened in 1817. So the marchers wanted to present a petition to the Prince Regent asking him to relieve the impoverished workers in the textile districts, so essentially to give them economic aid. The initial group consisted of 4,500 Blanketeers, whom gathered in Manchester on March 10th and set out in smaller groups. Local magistrates deemed the meeting to be seditious, so basically treasonous, so it was quickly dispersed. The leaders were arrested and only 300 Blanketeers officially set out. They made it as far as Stockport, 7 miles south of Manchester, where the local yeomanry turned them back. 1 Blanketeer was shot dead and several were wounded by the yeomanry. So this is an example of those petitions I mentioned earlier. So following the Sparfields meetings 1816, the radicals started adopting more legal means like petitioning, and they did not work because the government swiftly suppressed it. So you could argue that the government did not deal with it well, because by suppressing these legal means of the late 1810s prior to Peterloo, although Peterloo was in itself peaceful, it encouraged more violent activity to re-emerge in the 1820s, which we'll get onto another time. So, an utter catastrophe. 1 shot dead for bringing a petition to Parliament. And if you're curious, they're called Blanketeers because they had white blankets on the back of their satchels, which they would use to sleep. It's a bit like the Jarrow Crusade if you did history in the early 1900s Britain. So, now Luddism. I've included a picture of Ned Ludd to the side. The Luddites were machine smashers whom opposed the effects of the Industrial Revolution. Many leading Luddites were also Spenceans, so I've done another lesson on Spenceanism in itself that I recommend you check out, because you can see a lot of their ideology coming into play with the Luddites. So their activity was partially a result of poor working conditions in the textile factories and partially driven by ideology, namely Spenceanism. They were named Luddites after the fictional character of Ned Ludd, whom supposedly smashed 2 stocking frames in raids in 1799. They essentially partook in trade union activities prior to trade unions. Some begrudged machines because they took their jobs and put them out of work. Their attack on Middleton was the most significant Luddite disturbance, as following a food riot in Oldham on April 19th, an armed mob marched on Mr. Burton's steam loom factories in Middleton. The mob was beaten off by guards in the initial wave, killing 5 rioters and wounding 18 others. If you've ever read Atlas Shrugged, this is very reminiscent to the storming of Hank Rearden's steel factory. But I suppose we'll go into Ayn Rand when we do politics in the future. So the mob returned the next day with more people and more weapons. This time they succeeded in burning the factory down. Other than attacking another mill and not really doing much damage to it, this was the last Luddite disturbance in Lancashire and Cheshire, burning out as a movement in April of 1812. So then you have to think, what drove the Luddites? Partially ideology, partially poor working conditions caused by industrialisation for the workers, and what caused it to end? Partially government repression with military. I didn't mention it here, but they did send in the military to defend some other mills. I believe they were Richard Cartwright's or Richard Arkwright's, I don't remember. But the government ultimately didn't really stop it themselves. They really fizzled out due to economic recovery, I would probably say. But anyway, so that is the end of the 1810s. Next lesson, we're going to have a look at the 1820s, which is by far the shortest period that we will cover. The Cato Street Conspiracy of 1820, the Queen Caroline Affair of 1820 to 1821, and economic recovery ultimately caused the popular protest to subside until the early 1830s, where we saw a resurgence with the reform movement. So I will see you then.